much as you can on as little training as possible. In other words, achieve as much as you can on as little training as possible, and then just increase the training and keep increasing a little bit. The problem is many people jump in on high training and then they never know quite whether they actually were training too hard, and that if they trained slightly less hard, they would have done better. So it's incredibly complex, and it's very, very individualistic.
Hi everyone, it's Doc M. I'm your champion on wellbeing, and welcome to the season finale of the Edge series. Thank you so much for being with me over the last many weeks, and we've had some incredible guests, and I literally have saved the best for last. Anyone who's ever read any textbook on sports medicine, exercise physiology, human performance will know this gentleman whom I'm about to welcome onto the stage. And I'm so excited that he's here with us on the Edge series. Professor Tim Noakes, he's the Emeritus Professor at the University of Cape Town. He's now the chairman of the Noakes Foundation. He's the author of many, many books, and there's no point in me even listing all of them because it just goes on for a very, very long time. He's an honorary fellow. He's achieved many lifetime achievement awards for so many different things. And most of all, he stands up for science and he believes in the truth behind data. Professor Tim Noakes, thank you so much for being with me on The Edge. How are you?
Very well, Marcus, but I think you really set the bar a bit high today. I'm going to have to pull out all the stops to
Fantastic.
be able to match what you've said about me. But thank you very much. It's very kind of you.
I will do my best to ask you the right questions so that we can get into that. You know, something I love asking all of my guests, because we're doing this in lockdown, is where are you signing in from today?
Well, I'm in Cape Town, South Africa, right at the bottom of South Africa. And you can't get any further off the African continent. If you go further, you're into the Atlantic and heading to the South Pole. Absolutely. So we're right at the tip of Africa, and we're in lockdown still. And it's very cold today because it's midwinter. Yeah. So I'm dressed warmly, as you can see.
Very good. No, thank you. My wife and I, we honeymooned in South Africa. We did the garden route, and we ended in Cape Town, and many, many fond memories of those 2-3 weeks in your beautiful country. So thank you so much for joining in. So I'm going to begin with a piece of work, which is, you know, to say it's become legendary would be an understatement to it. As I said in the introduction, it is part and parcel of every training program on exercise physiology, sports medicine. And that is the theory which you developed in 1997 and published, which is the central governor model. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it is with the brain at the center of all activities. And what Professor Noakes was proposing was that it calibrates a safe exertion level for the body, limiting our abilities, almost a performance versus preservation switch and lever. I'd love to ask you, how did this theory come about? What was the journey that led to this discovery and proposal for you?
Well, unfortunately, Marcus, I was completely untrained in exercise physiology. So I hadn't got any dogmas. I didn't have any beliefs that I came in that my great professors had told me. And I think that was very, very fortunate. So when I started doing sports science in 1981, that's when I started teaching it officially. I had been trained as a medical doctor, and I'd been researching for 5 years on hearts and the metabolism of hearts. But from the day I started medicine, I'd been very interested in exercise science. It was completely overwhelmed me. I didn't want to know really much about medicine. So I spent my career in medicine saying, well, how would this apply to sport? And somehow I convinced the examiners to pass me, although I didn't have a clue about medicine. At least I'd been trained in sports medicine. And so because I was a physically active and an athlete, I was really interested, because the other point is that I started right at the bottom because exercise science was pretty vague in those days. It didn't have really much driving it. It was only just beginning. So when I started teaching the exercise sciences, I didn't have any dogmas, but they weren't ingrained in me. I might have had the dogmas, but they weren't ingrained, and I didn't owe them to anyone. So when we started our research, we had almost no equipment. And so we had to do very basic stuff. But what we did have to do is we had to actually measure stuff, because we couldn't have computers that calculated stuff and told you. So we went right back to the basics. And one of the basics at that time was stated that if you exercise an athlete at increasing intensity, their oxygen consumption would rise progressively And then it would reach a plateau and it wouldn't go any higher. And that was called the VO2 max, or maximum oxygen consumption. And they said, well, you see, it's obvious. The reason you stop is because you run out of oxygen. So that's what I taught, and that's what I thought. But then when we started doing our experiments with this archaic equipment, which we had to actually know what we were measuring, we couldn't see this thing. We couldn't see this plateau. So at that time, when you wrote a scientific paper, you had to say, we found a plateau in 100% of patients or athletes. Otherwise, your work wasn't published. But I said, but we didn't find it, so we never wrote that. And then eventually, I think in 1987, I was asked to speak at the American College of Sports Medicine, and I spoke about this. We couldn't find this plateau. So therefore, it can't be oxygen that's a limitation. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't oxygen. And then eventually, with more work, by 1996, I was asked to give another lecture at the American College of Sports Medicine. And because I'm a generalist, I'm not an expert in a tiny molecule or something, I gave the topic called Challenging Beliefs. And I looked at 6 things that I thought were wrong in the sports sciences, where I thought the science didn't support them. And number 1 was the VO2 max and oxygen limitation. So I basically said, I don't know what's limiting performance, but it's very likely not oxygen. Maybe it's something else that's accumulating in muscle and causing you to stop. But what I did notice at that time, I did state that it's really interesting that you don't get people dying at altitude. When people climb Mount Everest, it's true they may die, but a lot of people get there without dying. Same with heat stroke. Many people exercise in the heat, but they don't die. And also, I'd worked with heart patients for years, and patients didn't die. There seemed to be something regulating it. So I said, it looks like there's some sort of regulation, but I don't know what it is. Then, fabulously, a guy wrote a long article saying Noakes is wrong and everyone else is right. And he forced me to go back and read what the original people had said. And one of the original people was A.V. Hill. And what A.V. Hill had said, which I found, which no one had seen for 60 or 70 years, he said that at the peak of exercise, either the heart or the brain, there's a governor. He didn't call it a central governor. He said there's a governor either in the heart or the brain that protects the heart from damaging itself. And immediately I read that, I said, he's wrong, but he's right. He's wrong because you wouldn't put the regulator in the heart, you'd put the regulator in the brain. And the way it would work would be to slow down muscle contraction and muscle function. So that gave that became the central governor, that there was a regulated process designed to protect the body during exercise. And that would explain why very few people get into trouble during exercise. They may get tired, but they don't die. And so we then went and made some very simple experiments and were able to show that during maximal exercise, you do not recruit all your muscles, which you have to, all your muscle fibers, which if the old model is correct, you have to recruit all your muscles. And then when they're all full of lactic acid or whatever, you stop. There's no way that you can stop the muscles from working, but by the brain, if not all of them have been active. Yeah. And then it became very obvious, and we were able to do other experiments. For example, we had people exercising in the heat versus the cool condition. And we showed immediately that in the heat they slowed down much earlier, and it was because they were recruiting less muscle. So that was proving the model. And then once we'd said it, everyone said, "But it's obvious." I mean, we always knew it.
Yeah. That's always the case, I suppose. So you've got the brain, which is sensing various things across the physiological systems, which is creating a fail-safe mechanism, protecting you. Yeah. So before we go to the phase of the reserve, let's talk about those different sensing aspects. What exactly is the brain sensing? And perhaps it's a good time to maybe introduce this idea of fatigue, which is a subjective feeling that we all have. Yeah.
Well, one of the problems is it's very difficult to measure these things because we can only measure the output. We can measure the work performance, and that's the output. Yeah. We don't really know what the input is, and we can only do things very grossly. So very grossly, we can reduce your oxygen delivery, and that immediately reduces your performance. So we know oxygen is very important. We know heat's important because when we put you in the heat, you can't exercise as well as you do. We also suspect that there are metabolic factors like glycogen in the muscles. I'm not sure that that's a huge effect, but it is measurable under experimental conditions. And the other thing is muscle damage. If you have muscle damage, you won't be able to exercise. And then, of course, you could add any number of other things like illness and so on. But as I've said, it's very difficult to measure these things. And most of the experiments, we don't actually measure what's absolutely being sensed. So our presumption is that anything that can cause harm to your body will be measured. For example, I'm pretty convinced that in sprinting, the great challenge in sprinting is to your maximum speed is the strength of your hamstring in resisting tearing, because the muscles are so powerful. And A.V. Hill said this in the 1920s. He said that if you allowed the muscles to work fully, they would fracture the bones. And great sprinters have producing so much power that it's very possible that they would rupture the muscles. So I suspect there's something in preventing rupturing muscles. And the other one is that if the blood flow is too great through the lungs, you could kill yourself from what we call pulmonary edema, as you know. And that has to be protected against. So I honestly do think that during high intensity exercise, the cardiac output becomes a limiting factor, because not that the heart couldn't pump more, but it has to be stopped, because if it does pump more, it's going to kill you. Right. Your lungs are going to get full of fluid and you'll drown. So those are some of the factors that are clearly obvious. And, you can go to any environmental factors that might be important, sunshine and goodness knows what other things. All of those things could be measured by the body and become a factor in impairing performance.
And might it be fair to assume that whilst this is multifactorial, at each individual level, the factors, which is the overdriving switch, could change? Like your factor might be very different to what mine might be.
Oh, absolutely. And, for example, once you've got heart disease, that's clearly your exercise performance come down dramatically. And I think that's because of by the blood pressure on the right side of the heart, in the pulmonary circulation probably goes up in people who are in sort of mild heart failure. And that would then become the obvious factor, because you just can't afford to go into heart failure. So you'd be restricted. Because I was always interested in how quickly the exercise performance falls in some people who've got heart disease.
Yeah. What I was interested in, and I've had the chance to do research in many parts of the world, including on Everest and in the Arctic. And, you speak about this in your work as well, which is this idea of the emergency reserve and the body holding itself back, but it has that capacity if it needs to be released, and it can do so safely. My main question is what is that reserve and how can we exploit it? Because clearly there's a difference in exploitation between an Usain Bolt versus me. I mean, apart from the physiology and the biomechanics, he clearly has an advantage there. So how does that happen?
Yeah, I don't even think you need to worry about yourself. You just have to look at who comes second in the Olympic Games, and that person, that person in every event, in my opinion, is if it's a longer event where the mind becomes important. I don't think 100 meters it's really a mental thing. I think that's more purely physical. Of course, you have to have incredible self-belief and all those things and resist all the pressures and so on. But basically, it's more of a physical event. But once you start exercising for more than 5 or 10 minutes, the brain becomes critically important, because now you know that you've got to keep going for another minute or two. And then the question arises, is it worth it? And that's the key question that the elite athlete has to answer. And the answer has to always be yes. This, however painful it is, it's still worth it. And that then becomes the difference. So in answer to your question, I'd say two things. I don't think that the best athletes have the most pain. Now, that will come to this one. I think that pain is something you produce in your own mind.
Right.
It's not really telling you that the body's failing. It's a decision you make. And a lot of people then say the pain was impossible, I couldn't cope, when in fact they've quit for other reasons. So I think that it's very important that the elite athletes have to know exactly why they're there. And the ones who do the best are the ones who have the most reason to be successful.
That's interesting. And it's a beautiful segue into what we want to talk about next, which is the role of pain. And of course, for everyone watching, it's important for us to differentiate that pain is a complex event in our body. There's, of course, the physical nature, whether it's neuropathic pain or vascular pain or other types of pain mechanisms. And then there's the emotional side of pain, which is where the subjective feelings of fatigue sort of start to creep in for people. So let's talk a little bit about that. So do you want to extend your thought then about the role of pain and how people can switch it on, switch it off, particularly athletes?
So one of the videos I love to show, this is the classic moment, 1989 Ironman triathlon, the greatest endurance race of all time, because we had the two greatest athletes and they raced each other for 8 hours. And at about 7 hours 50, the defining moment in the race begins and happens. But before that, Mark Allen, who is the less favored athlete, who is now still got 10 miles to run, he is about to quit, and he's quit 5 times before. 5 times he's got in the same position from where he can win, but he quits in a sense and he drops back and comes 3rd or 4th.
Yeah.
And he is going along and he's about to decide to quit when all of a sudden on the horizon, he sees the shaman, the Indian shaman. By that I mean a South American Indian. Yeah. Shaman who had been consulting him. He had gone to consult this guy and he'd lived with him for a couple of weeks to learn their culture. The shaman appears and he looks and then he can't see the shaman. But the moment the shaman appears, he said, I knew I'm going to win this race. So he said, all of a sudden my doubts went, my pain went, and he said, I was just waiting and I waited and I waited. And he waits for 9 miles. And then at the 10th mile, something happens and he takes off and he wins the race. And he never lost that race again. So what is that? And I must tell you another lovely story that one of my very best PhD students just finished. And he published some fabulous work on the central governor model. But why did he do that? He did it because he came from a culture of, he's a very good scientist, a medical scientist, a very medical doctor, and a really competitive international class triathlete. Right. And he said he would go to the races in Europe and he would look at the list of competitors and he'd say, can't beat him, can't beat him, can't beat him, can't beat him. Might be this guy, but definitely I can beat that guy. So I'm going to come 6th in this race. Right. And he would come 6th every time or whatever. And then one day he came to the championships and he's read the list and it's his 6th again, you see. So with 15 miles to go in the marathon, he's lying 6th as he predicted. And he's going along and it's painful and he's hurting and he's never going to win this race and he's only going to come 6th. When all of a sudden the 5th guy drops out, he sees him, he drops out. Now he's lying 5th. Oh, that's interesting. And then, of course, the story goes 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and then all of a sudden he's leading the race with 10 Ks to go. He said, I sprinted the last 10 Ks. It was the easiest race I ever had. And so he said, then I realized there's something more going on here in the brain.
Yeah.
But he said, his personality was such that that's how he was. He was not a winner. Yeah. Although he's a very, very clever guy and a brilliant athlete, superb athlete. He said, I just never quite had that edge to make me win the races, even though I had the potential. So his name is Andreas Venhorst, and his PhD is very, very special.
Very interesting. And in fact, whilst researching for my book and the chapter on running, I was really interested to see, and there were some interesting studies where they published basically all running data of people completing races above 5,000 meters globally over 20, 30 years. And what they found was, as they looked at the split timings, the last kilometer for almost every single running cohort was always the fastest, irrespective of the distance covered. And I'm a full marathon runner as well, and I've seen that myself. Irrespective of how much pain I think I'm in, that last kilometer is one of the easiest ones to do. There's something which changes that gets you over the line. So what is it? That's the question, is how is that pain being overcome? Is there any idea physiologically?
Well, it's really interesting, because when Roger Bannister opened the 1997 Manchester Games, Commonwealth Games, and we had a conference there, and he asked me, I was asked to speak, and I knew he was there. So I went and looked at his 4-minute mile, and it's exactly the same. His last 400 meters was faster than the second and third.
Right.
So he had sped up. It wasn't quite as fast as the first, but he'd sped up. And then I suddenly realized that, somewhere I had data on the different runners' 10K world record performances. And there it was. They got faster at the end. And it was sitting there in where I keep this sort of information, and hadn't looked at it. So what's happening, it's almost as if when you see the finish, the brain says, okay, fine, now there's a little bit in reserve and you can go for it at this point. So that's the only thing I can think, because you can't override it before you get into the last lap or the last whatever.
Yeah.
You can't override it. And I've had arguments with other people who say, no, the central governor, it's your will, and so on and so forth. And I've run enough marathons, as you have, to know that there are days when it doesn't matter what you think. You can't get your legs to run any faster, and you reach 30 kilometers or 20 miles and you just can't speed up. And other times you just fly through it. Yeah. And that's, to me, that is the physical preparation, maybe not the ideal, but you cannot override this thing. It's just too powerful.
Yeah. What I find interesting is that it's not just limited to the really long distances. Even if it's a 5 kilometer, 10 kilometer race, subjectively, I just feel my body somehow knows what the finish is. And so, one day might be a 10K, the next day will be 5, but I still have this internal dialogue going on inside of my brain that it then switches at different levels differently. Yeah.
Can I just give you one amazing observation that everyone who's run ultras in South Africa, we ultra mad. And if you haven't run the Comrades Marathon, which is 56 miles, you're just not there. You just didn't do it. And so you'd start in January, and the race is used to be May the 31st. And in January, you'd get up and you'd be a little overweight, and to run 20 kilometers was really hard effort. And then by March, you're really starting to get fit. April, you're feeling fantastic. Yeah. And you run a marathon in March or April, and you finished. You run flat out and you finished. You continue to train and you run the Comrades and you pass your marathon in, let's say, 10 minutes slower. And you don't even notice you've gone through the marathon. True. It's an astonishing observation. You've still got another 50 kilometers to run. Yeah. And it's as if you haven't even run the marathon. Yeah. You just you feel almost nothing. Yeah. And you ask the elite athletes, it's even better. They can go even further before they start noticing the distance. Yeah. But it's absolutely astonishing that when you start the race, the brain knows today it's 56 miles or 90 kilometers, and you're only going to get tired at 40 miles. You're not going to get tired at 20 miles. You're going to get tired at 40 miles. Yeah. And so it ramps up quite differently. So what do we know about these things? Well, we don't know too much, but those are the observations.
Yeah. So anyone watching at this point in time, wondering why we're speaking so much about running, I think one of the central takeaway messages that I've learned in my own experience is that as much time you put on the track physically, there's also a big essence going on inside of the brain and having to overcome those demons inside. A very interesting study, which I found from Scotland, published in 1981, looked at swimmers. And they divided the cohort into 3 groups. There was an elite group, there was a club level group, and there was a non-elite sort of everyday type of weekend warrior swimmer. And they measured pain thresholds, and pain thresholds were almost the same across all 3 groups. What was interesting is the number of repetitions that the different groups could do was very significantly different. The elite swimmers could do 132 reps, the club levels could do 89 reps, and the lay people could do 70 reps. And what was even then, they took it one step further and they looked at peak season versus off peak. And there was a difference there as well. So there's clearly a pain threshold level that we're able to calibrate or titrate. Have you got any tips, techniques that you've seen athletes use to overcome and change that threshold voluntarily?
Yeah, I'm going to give you two little stories there. So when before I started running, I rode a lot, and we rode quite high level. I mean, not absolutely, not quite international level, but just below that. And one day we would train and we'd do 400 meters, or sorry, 500 meters it was, because that was a fourth of the distance that we would race. And we'd normally do 6 of these. We'd do 6. And one day we'd done our 6th and we started paddling back towards the boathouse, and the coach said, no, turn around, go back to the start. What's wrong today? He said, no, go back to the start. So we did another one. And he said, no, go back to the start. And we'd finished up, we did 10. And we realized the 10th was no more difficult than the first. And so then, because we were in pretty good shape, but that was a breakthrough for me. Then one of the greatest books on running is called Once a Runner by John Parker. And there's a moment in that book where he describes that this guy is now finally ready to become an international class runner.
Right.
And so his friend says, fine, today we're going to run 400 meters. And so he does 10. So they say, no, that's just the start. So we'll do another 10. So they do another 10. No, that's just the start. They do another 10. And eventually, in theory, they did something like 400 meters in a person who'd only ever considered he could do 10.
Right.
And that stretched him. And then he became an international class runner. Yeah. I think that most of us never push ourselves beyond what's comfortable. And so that's the reality. And those elite athletes have had to push themselves beyond their comfort zone. And that's what you have to practice. You just have to keep doing it. You know, when I look at these amazing Tour de France cyclists who do something which is just, it's unbelievable every day, to go out there and do 5 or 6 hours a day is unbelievable. But, you know, they're absolutely the best human specimens you can possibly find. Yeah. But they still have to do that 5 or 6 hours a day, and day in and day out, because they have to convince this brain that they can do it. And I suspect that they are a cut above everything, and that they do have the ability to do that. And most of us never could do that. And we can't, even if we could get our brains to do it, or physically, we probably couldn't do it. So it's a complex combination. But I think what you're describing there is the mind of the elite athlete is either genetically better, or it's because they train. But you have to do that training to get there. You look at the Kenyan runners. I mean, they train as hard as anyone has ever trained, and they have incredible success. And I do believe they have certain advantages living at altitude and living the lifestyle that they do. But gee, they still have to train really hard to get where they get.
Yeah. And actually, talking about that, given that Olympics around the corner, and of course last year or the year before, Eliud famously completed the sub 2 hour marathon. Yeah. Projecting forward, what's your prediction on how low this time will become? How much can human beings push themselves to get faster and faster at that level of racing?
Well, they'll always improve, but the measure of this margin of improvement will be just tiny, tiny, tiny. And I think that's what we've seen. You know, it's interesting, when Eliud Kipchoge was going to run at Monza, that was 3 years ago, I predicted that he would run 2 hours and 30 seconds, because I knew that going from 2 hours and 3 minutes to below 2 hours was too much. It was just too much of a big jump. And I didn't believe that anyone could go 3 minutes slower. Then when he did it more recently in Vienna, was it in Vienna? No, it wasn't Vienna. It was
Berlin.
In Berlin, yeah. So when he did that special event, he was, the advantages he had, they'd thought it out so carefully that it was actually quite a lot easier for him in that event. But the point is that he has run it, even though it was a supported marathon under 2 hours.
Yeah.
The children who are now training in Kenya know that you got to run 2 hours, so they're going to be different.
How much of it is the fact that his wife was standing at the finish line?
I think the reason was he didn't have physiologists involved. I'll tell you why. Because in the first event, he had physiologists and who were telling him VO2 max and lactate thresholds and so on.
Yeah.
This time, they got the aerodynamicists out there, and the aerodynamics guys worked out the absolute perfect pattern for the runners in front of him.
Yeah.
So we all thought that you had to be behind the group which was going like this, an arrowhead. And they said, no, it's completely wrong. It's the Y shape. And he was running in an area that was essentially no air resistance. It was astonishing they worked it out.
Yeah.
And so that was the key to that success, was that they'd worked out the aerodynamic profile, and they needed 9 people around him so that he could have absolutely no drag. And that made it a lot easier. He still had to run for 2 hours at a very fast pace.
That's right.
I'm not taking it away from him, but the difference was they got the aerodynamics experts in, not the physiologists, and that made the key difference. Of course, having his wife present would, and I think his daughter was also present, so that would make a huge difference.
So let's talk about the other aspects of running, and of course we enjoy it for the joy it brings us. But when running gets longer and further, it does have negative consequences on the human body. There's a very clear relationship after which actually it causes more damage over a long run. So what is that point? And how can an individual know for themselves how much running is a good level for me?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. From the research that I've read, it's clear to me that the very best athletes can train more, and they can train harder, and they can survive it, and that we each have a plateau that we can train through. And I knew for myself, I knew exactly what that plateau was, and that was a very narrow margin. But below it, I was not doing optimally, but above it, I was also not doing optimally. And I just used to listen to my body and let it tell me how ready I was. And there were moments when you perform like you can't believe, and then a week later, it's all over. So the margins are so fine. I always advise people, we'll get back to answer your question, but I always advise people, do as much as you can on as little training as possible. In other words, achieve as much as you can on as little training as possible, and then just increase the training and keep increasing a little bit. The problem is many people jump in on high training, and then they never know quite whether they actually were training too hard, and that if they trained slightly less hard, they would have done better. So it's incredibly complex, and it's very, very individualistic.
Yeah.
And we are all very different. And I think that just looking at the training that Eliud Kipchoge gets up every morning and does X, and you must do that, that's not going to work, unfortunately. So we each have to find what works for us. I think most of us, if you're in running, you have a character disorder, and that is that you're always wanting to do too much. So, I mean, that was classic for myself. I was always overtraining. It didn't matter. And my best races were when I was injured and had to rest. Then I was doing much better. So that's a fatal character flaw, that it's very easy to overdo things. And I think that the error I made was I came up in the era when marathon running had just started, the 1970s. And we thought you had to run a marathon every 3 months or something, or every 4 months. And that's clearly wrong. And I look around, and all of us, we wore out a bit too early. I think that you should run one marathon or ultra marathon a year and one other race, and that's it. Right. And that will give you 30 or 40 years of running competitively. It's if you try to stack it all in too early that you get a problem. So that's from my observations of 40 years of watching other runners. You only have so many marathons in your body, and you need to rather spread them out over 30 years rather than try to do them all in one go.
Fabulous. Well, that was a lovely journey through running, and I really enjoy that. We're going to now switch tack a little bit to focus on work that you've really vested yourself in for the last many years. And I love the title of this series. I was watching it online recently. It's Insulin Resistant Stupid. It's fantastic for all the doctors out there. We're going to be talking about diabetes and low carb diets, but let's start with that phrase, Why did you get attracted to insulin out of all things, and particularly this idea that it's insulin resistant, stupid?
Okay, well, let's start when I missed it. So in 1978, one of my great friends was just wanting to do his PhD. I was doing my PhD at the time, and he wanted to do his PhD. And he said, I'm going to study post-exercise ketosis. This is 1978, remember? And I said, why? He said, no, because there's no literature on it. We don't know what causes ketosis, and particularly what causes post-exercise ketosis. And he was quite right. There was no knowledge. So we eventually decided that we should look at carbohydrates and ketosis, because the evidence seemed to suggest that if you cut your carbs, you'd get ketosis. So I and a friend who was another marathon runner, we did it. Firstly, we ate a high carbohydrate diet. Then we ran on the treadmill for 2 hours and we monitored our ketones for the next 6 or 8 hours. But we measured glucose and insulin at the same time. So that was the one experiment. The other day we did nothing. We were just controlling the third day. We ran as far hard as we could for 3 days and we ate no carbohydrates. So we came in carbohydrate depleted. And we got a massive ketosis. So there we go. That was ketosis was being driven by carbohydrate deficiency, as everyone knows, but it wasn't. The fact that we could publish this in a major journal showed that it wasn't very well known. What I didn't notice was the glucose and insulin results on myself. And what happened was I couldn't regulate my glucose during exercise, except when I've been on the low-carb diet. So when I've been on the high-carb diet, my glucose rose during exercise, and it shouldn't do that. That's what I think. Because I'd read all the literature, but I didn't notice it. There's my glucose going up. And what was more frightening was my insulin, when we arrived at the laboratory, was 6 times normal. 6 times normal.
Wow.
And so I had profound insulin resistance. And I had no clue. And we all looked, oh, you've got a high insulin. Oh, it's obvious because I'm eating lots of carbohydrate. Why wouldn't you have a high insulin? But my insulin stayed high all day. So even though we did our 2-hour run and so on and didn't eat for the whole day, my insulin at the end of the day was still high. So I had hyperinsulinemia, which is type 2 diabetes. We now know that.
Yep.
We didn't at that time. So at the age of 28, I was already type 2 diabetic without realizing it. And of course, I was advising people to eat all these carbs, and I was eating all these carbs. And eventually, of course, I had to develop type 2 diabetes, the disease from which my father had died. And that was the worst part for me. It was too terrible watching my father deteriorate. And that's what happens with type 2 diabetes. You destroy all the arteries and you suffer the consequences.
Yeah.
So, but I'd watched my father die without knowing what it was all about. He was getting the best treatment possible from the most qualified professors and so on. And they were killing him because they didn't understand the disease. So eventually, by chance, I discovered the low carbohydrate diet. By complete chance, I received an email that said, lose 6 pounds in 6 weeks without hunger. And I said, but we know that can't happen. It's untrue. And I looked at the names, and they were Westman, Verlick, and Finney. I said, but these are 3 fabulous scientists. And they referring to Dr. Atkins. He's the man who's killing us by telling us to eat saturated fat. This is an absolute disgrace. I am shocked that 3 really good scientists could sell out. I wonder how much they're being paid to sell out. That was my immediate impression. And I said, I'm so angry, I'm going to go and buy the book. So I bought the book and I read it. And 2 hours later, I said, oh my gosh, I got it wrong for 33 years. And what I've been telling people to do is wrong. So anyway, I decided I better change. So from that moment, I went onto a low carbohydrate diet. And within weeks, my health started improving. I lost all the excess weight I'd accumulated over 30 years. And life was fantastic. And eventually I checked and I was diabetic. So I've treated my diabetes and I'm now diabetic free. I'm in remission. I can't eat high carbohydrate diets one day and I'm back into diabetes. But as long as I stay off the carbs, I'm in good shape. So the next thing that happened was, of course, I had to tell people. They saw, gosh, I'd lost so much weight. I was looking so amazing. And they said, what did you do? Have you got cancer? That was the question. So I said, no, I just discovered this high fat, low carbohydrate diet. It's by Atkins. What? You're going to kill yourself. Your cholesterol is going to go through the roof and so on.
Yeah.
So eventually I decided I better write about it. So I started writing about it. And that was the end for me. My university took the rug away from me. The Medical Research Council took all my funding away. The other funders took their funding away, and I was thrown out to the dogs.
Yeah.
And so, it was quite interesting. And eventually, I landed up with a case against me for unprofessional conduct for advising a mother to wean her baby onto this diet, which is exactly what the dietary guidelines are, but because of financial influences on universities and other people, they're not allowed to say that. So, and I'd said it, I'd broken the omerta, the silence. Right. I'd broken the silence, and so I had to be silenced. So I went to court for 4 years. We wrote a book about it called The Real Food on Trial. Yeah. And fortunately, it saved my life. I should not be with you today because my dad took 10 years to die from diabetes. I've had it for probably 12, perhaps 13 years. And I'm doing fine, as far as I can see. Yeah. So I shouldn't be here, or if I was here, I would have major medical complications. Yeah. So I'm living. I was given a second life, and I'm thankful for Eric Westman and his team for allowing me to do that. It's just a pity my profession doesn't quite understand it as yet.
And we've got many, I'm sure, viewers who either have diabetes themselves or diabetes in the family, and the pre-diabetic levels around the world are so high. I had Michael Snyder on the show recently, and he was telling me in the Western world, there's a 15% of people have pre-diabetes, but 90% of them don't even know they have it. In fact, higher. So 35% of people have pre-diabetes and 90% don't even know they have it. But if they're watching, people are going to be wondering and asking this question. Diabetes equals insulin. I have diabetes. My doctor is prescribing insulin. But here we are with Professor Noakes, and they've heard me say this before as well, is that it's fixing the wrong problem, and giving insulin is actually leading to more damage. Do you want to walk through that logic for people who are trying it hard to figure out these moving pieces in their brains?
Okay, so in the 1920s, there were two forms of diabetes. People recognized that there were young people who were getting diabetes, and they usually died within a year or two, and there were older people. And they distinguished with them, but hardly at all. And all the focus was not on the people with the late onset diabetes. It was on the children, because the children were going to die. And at that time, there was some guys researching. Newberg was one of them. And Newberg was investigating a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet. And he was on the verge of proving that if you took an older person with diabetes and put them on a high-fat diet, they could live forever and the glucose would be relatively normal. He was on the verge. And then, unfortunately, some researchers in Canada, Banting amongst them, Banting and Best and two others, discovered insulin. And within a year or so, insulin was widely available. And then everyone with diabetes was assumed that they've all got the same problem. They're not producing enough insulin, so you must get the insulin injections. Newberg's research was trashed, because now there was no need for a high-fat diet for treating diabetes. Diabetic patients were all doing well on the insulin. But unfortunately, the older people, even though they were being treated with insulin, they weren't doing better. They were doing okay. They weren't dying, but they weren't having a normal life. And they would get all the complications that we recognize for type 2 diabetes, particularly vascular disease. It's only in 1960 that Burston and his wife, Yellow, I forget their first names, in New York City, develop a technique for measuring insulin. And now all of a sudden they can measure insulin. And in their first paper published in 1960, guess what? They found that people with type 2 diabetes, that's the adult onset diabetes, and the older people like myself, have too much insulin. So all of a sudden, people have been treating this disease with insulin, but the people have already got too much insulin. So, but you can't change that because the industry is established and the production of insulin is a major industry and you can't change it overnight. So that is why adult onset diabetes or type 2 diabetes who are over-secreting insulin, have insulin resistance, are still being treated with insulin because they're trying to control their glucose, but the glucose is not the issue. The insulin is the issue. It's the insulin that is causing all the complications. And the only way to help a patient with type 2 diabetes is to get them off the insulin. And that will then bring their glucoses down. Their body will become less inflamed. They'll lose weight. They'll lose particularly fat in the liver and fat in the viscera, which is what really kills you.
Yeah.
And you may then have a more normal life. But to treat diabetes with insulin, unfortunately, is the worst possible way of doing it. Yeah. You must try to get the patients off carbohydrates, and that will allow them to reduce their insulin intake. So that's what's happened to me. I do take a diabetic drug, metformin, which is probably one of the safest drugs there is in medicine. Yeah. And that keeps my glucose under control, even though I'm eating essentially no carbohydrate every day. My diabetes, unfortunately, was so advanced that I can't completely reverse it by low carbohydrate diets.
Yeah. Thank you. And anyone who would like to learn more about this topic, I would invite you to watch the episode I filmed with Professor Robert Lustig, who's recently published a book on this topic. And we really went into the details of not only the sort of visceral fat versus abdominal fat that Professor Noakes was talking about, but also the role of glucose and how insulin can control it and the various mechanisms around it. What I want to ask next, brother, is this whole idea of eating a diet with high fat is bad. And it was interesting. I was watching some of your previous work, and you referred to a study by Raven et al. In 1966, where he had people on a 70% high fat diet. And in that group of people, their triglycerides went down, their lipids went down, and their phospholipids went down as well. But yet here we are 50 years later, and we're still having this debate about fat being bad for you and fat leading to the clogging up of arteries. Please shed light for all the viewers.
Well, I've just published today in Open Heart, British Medical Journal Open Heart, an article in where I look at the most famous diet intervention in history. It's the Women's Health Initiative. It cost $700 million, and it followed a group of 48,000 women. 48,000 women were followed initially for 8 years, and now they reported the 5-year follow-up data. And what was really interesting was that at the end of the 8 years, they had different groups of women, but the women who had heart disease at the start of the trial and who were then followed for 8 years, those women who ate the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet were at a 26-fold increased risk of developing further heart conditions. You heard that? Mm. These people with heart disease eating the heart-healthy, low-fat, high-carbohydrate, prudent diet increased their risk of further complications. This paper I've just published looks at the follow-up data for the 5 years, so they've now been studied for 13 years. And guess what happened? The women with heart disease at the start of the trial who were put on a heart-healthy diet were at a 60% increased risk of developing cardiac problems during the 13 years of follow-up. So the heart-healthy diet made people less heart-healthy. What the point of the article is to show how the authors hid that data. They absolutely hid it. And you will not see it unless you go and look for it, that there actually was harm done. It turns out what's happening is very clear. If you have insulin resistance, where you over-secrete insulin in response to carbohydrate, you will damage yourself by eating a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets. And that's what's happened. So that study beautifully confirms everything we've said. If you are insulin sensitive, you can eat essentially what you like. That's your choice. If you're insulin resistant, you will develop diabetes, dementia, cancer, etc. if you eat high carbohydrate diets. Now, there's also published in January this year is called the Women's Health Study. It's not the Women's Health Initiative, which is the study I've just referred to. Yeah. It's the Women's Health Study, which was set up in Boston starting in 1993. They looked at about 10,000 women, and they originally wanted to see if these women took vitamin E or aspirin, would they reduce their risk of heart attack? And they found no effect. But what they did at the start of the experiment in 1993, they measured everything on these ladies that you could possibly think of measuring, every blood test you could possibly think. And what they cleverly did, they said, okay, well, we didn't find any benefits for vitamin E or aspirin. Let's follow these ladies for 20 years, and see who gets heart disease and why they get heart disease. And they found, as published in January this year, that if you had diabetes, your risk of a heart attack was increased tenfold, which is the highest ratio that has ever been measured. If your cholesterol is elevated, your risk was marginally increased. It was so small that it's irrelevant. And all the risk factors, all the insulin resistance risk factors were more important by far than even smoking. So we've always said smoking is the greatest risk factor for heart disease. It's not. It's diabetes, diabetes, diabetes. Yeah. And people described this long ago, that it's diabetes which drives heart disease. And we have forgotten it because we've gone on the cholesterol bandwagon. Yeah. So the bandwagon is completely wrong. So that's the one point. Now let me get back to Raven, because you mentioned him. Raven in the 1960s by the 1980s, he was on the verge of proving that a low carbohydrate diet was essential for people with metabolic syndrome, which was what you described. He was on the verge, but he didn't cross over the verge. And why not? Because he was working with cardiologists at Stanford University. And if he'd come out and said, guys, you got to eat a high-fat diet to prevent heart disease, what happened to me would have happened to him. He would have been isolated and thrown out. And so if you read his book, he has a book, and I don't have it quite with me immediately. He falls directly between the two stools. He says, you've got to eat a little bit more fat, but you've got to eat lots of carbohydrate as well. And because you've got to eat the carbohydrates to prevent your cholesterol going up, but you've got to eat the fat to prevent your diabetes from worsening. And he falls right in the middle of the stool. And he still promotes a diet of 45% carbohydrates, despite the fact that he had shown that lower carbohydrate diets were beneficial. He'd shown that about a 30% carbohydrate diet was beneficial, but he never went lower. What he did, he went higher. He went back up to that 45. If he'd gone down to 10, he would have solved the problem. And we would have known then, even before Atkins, that this was the best diet for people with heart disease and diabetes.
Yeah. Again, for the education of our viewers, as the carbohydrate load increases, the insulin drive goes up. Insulin does a variety of things, including correcting and trying to manage glucose. But what it also does, it's the de novo hepatic generation of triglycerides in your body. So it's actually producing more triglycerides, particularly in the liver, which causes that visceral fat, which is so dangerous for everyone. The triglyceride levels go up in the blood. But insulin also has an effect on blood vessels. It actually increases the size of the blood vessels, making them thicker, making you more prone towards damage as well. So if you're wondering what a healthy triglyceride level is, it's 5.5 milliequivalents per liter. Is that the cutoff, Professor Noakes?
Yeah, we normally talk about 1 millimole, so it's a slightly different, but I think 1 millimole is 5.5 milliequivalents. I'm just looking for a paper that I was working with. Anyway, in the Women's Health Study, in 1993, when they were preparing the study, they took blood samples from their patients and they studied them under nuclear magnetic resonance. And I'll explain why this is. And what that does is looks at the size of the particles and the distribution of the different particles of all the lipoproteins. That includes LDL, HDL, VLDL. It's everything. And they came up with an insulin resistance score. So what you're saying is absolutely correct. If you're eating a high carbohydrate diet and you're insulin resistant and you secrete lots of insulin, you modify all the lipoproteins, the VLDL, the HDL, the LDL, and the ILDL. They all change. And they change subtly, and you can't measure it the conventional way. But if you measure it with nuclear magnetic resonance, you come up with a score which tells you how insulin resistant you are. And that's a massive predictor of your risk of heart attack. So although you're measuring lipoproteins, these are being influenced by how much insulin your body is secreting. Yeah. So you're absolutely correct. And unfortunately, I just can't find the article at the moment. Yeah. But they published actually 5 years ago, which I missed it. And they looked at your lipoprotein insulin resistance score, and it predicted who is going to get heart disease in the next 5 or 10 years. Mm. Whereas cholesterol is hopeless. It's hopeless for predicting these things. So just to emphasize your point, when you eat carbohydrates and you secrete insulin, you damage all your lipoproteins, but you damage all of them a little bit. And when you measure all of the change, then you come up with this lipoprotein insulin resistance score, and that's the real predictor.
Yeah. So the practical question that everyone is probably asking now, okay, we're convinced we need to be eating a low carbohydrate, high fat diet. What does low carbohydrate mean in terms of percentage, grams, type of sugars, glycemic indices, etc.? Let's get practical for people.
Okay, so now something else I've discovered in the last few weeks of reading, and reading this fabulous book as well, Ravenous, by Sam Apple. It's just a fabulous book. So what Ravenous does is it begins to focus on sugar as the real problem. And what the person who really identifies sugar as the problem is Dr. Cleve in the 1970s. He comes up and writes a book called The Saccharine Disease, which I just happen to have by chance. Saccharine disease. And he says it's simple. Chronic diseases become much more prevalent after the 1930s, 1940s. So if diet was involved, we had to change the diet somewhere in the 1900s, early 1900s, takes 20 or 40 years, and then you get the disease. So he said, what did we change in the 1900s? And he says, was it refined sugar, refined carbohydrates, particularly white bread? And he said, well, the interesting thing is the British started eating white bread in 1800, not in 1900, in 1800. And the diet became refined. We started taking out fiber already in the 1800s, but heart disease didn't appear. Diabetes didn't appear. It only appears in the 1920s, 1930s, when we start increasing the sugar consumption, particularly after 1900, after the First World War and so on. That's when the sugar intake goes up. So his argument is that sugar is the number one driver of our chronic disease. So the first thing you have to do with your diet is cut out sugar. As soon as you cut out sugar, you have to cut out all ultra-processed foods. That means if it comes in a packet and it's got a list of ingredients, you don't eat it. You just eat the natural foods, which come straight from the farm. And that's what we say. We say eat real foods. So people ask me, what do I eat? I eat meat, fish, eggs, dairy, nuts, vegetables, and a very, very occasional fruit. But it's on the basis is the meat, the fish, the dairy, and the eggs. That's it. And vegetables a little bit, but not much. I don't need vegetables much. So that's it. And you just have to write that down and it becomes easy. Of course, it's not easy for everyone because you can't necessarily get all that good food when you need it. It doesn't have to be expensive, by the way. You can eat good food without being hugely expensive. So that's what it is. You've got to cut out sugar. You've got to cut out sugary beverages. You've got to cut out sugar adding to your tea and coffee. And then it's the ultra-processed foods have to go. And you don't shop at the supermarket, or if you do, you only go to the meat and the fish, the meat, the dairy, and the vegetable sections in the supermarket.
Yeah, I had Bonnie Kaplan on the show earlier on in the season, and she was talking about 50% of the Western world is consuming food which is ultra processed, and it's better that they just eat the packaging because at least there'll be some fiber in it that way. But yeah, that's the point. Very well taken. So we've spoken about this relationship between carbohydrate and fat for disease. There are, of course, people watching who are runners and athletes and exercise enthusiasts, and they're going to be asking themselves, well, hang on, I was told that, I have a big bowl of pasta before marathon day, or, I load up on carbs during training season. The science of that is changing. Why don't we talk about that a little bit as well?
Yeah, indeed. So it's so funny because the Journal of Physiology invited me to discuss this and to debate somebody else. And because I knew the other person rather well, I knew exactly what the person had researched and had thought over the past 20 years. And I could show some deviances there, should we say. And so I wrote the article and they said, no, we can't publish this. The reason was because it was so powerful, but it was said because I was attacking the other person and not focusing on the facts. Well, that may be so, but then let's just change it and put in the step. So I have looked at the literature and I can assure every single person listening to this that there is no documented evidence that either of these diets is beneficial, more beneficial than the other for performance. There are 24 studies showing that a high carbohydrate diet versus a high fat diet, absolutely no difference on performance whatsoever. And these are randomized controlled trials. There are studies which have been published recently, which are not randomized controlled trials, and they are of elite race walkers. And they've received a huge amount of publicity in Runner's World and elsewhere, and in the Journal of Physiology itself. But they are not randomized controlled trials, so they cannot tell us the true outcomes. And the athletes were actually they were in debate with the scientists of which diet should I follow. That's not how you do science. Because there's a huge possibility that the people will believe what they're told and then they will perform accordingly. But it's very interestingly, in the most recent of those studies, 3 of the 10 athletes who were put on a high-fat diet, and these are Olympic class athletes, produced their ultimate performance in their history after going on the diet. 3 did. 3 out of 10. That's the sort of diet I want. But anyway, so then just to confirm that, together with a group in Pennsylvania, Philip Prince and his team, we did a fabulous study. And these guys, they're just methodical and ruthlessly correct in what they do. And we took, I think it was 8 athletes, all could run 5Ks under 20 minutes. They repeatedly ran 5Ks on the treadmill. And so we repeatedly did that because we wanted to see, is this a real effect or not? And we put them on the high carbohydrate diet, and then half of them went on the other diet, and it was absolutely perfectly matched. Yeah. And at the end of the day, there was no effect of either the high carbohydrate or the high fat diet. Now, why is it important? Because those athletes are better than 88% of all North American athletes. So that tells me that I'm speaking to the vast majority of runners when I said there is no difference. And I admit that Eliud Kipchoge, I'm not sure that he's going to run 2 hours on a high-fat diet. I can't say that. Maybe he'd run 1 hour 59. I don't know. So, but I exclude that. I exclude the very best athletes because we haven't got studies on them. But on the average to quite good athletes, there's absolutely no benefit. And let me just finish up with a lovely story that I mentioned Mark Allen. So I got very close to Dave Scott, who was the guy who he beat, you see. So Dave Scott had beaten Mark 5 times in a row. And then this was the time when Mark won. And Dave Scott was a vegetarian at the time. He was largely vegetarian. And he wrote to me about 4 years ago, and he said, Tim, I read your book, The Real Meal Revolution, and I changed my diet to the diet you prescribed, the high-fat diet. He said, I'd been moving that way. Even at the end of my career, I started eating a lot more fish. And at age of 40, he came back and finished second at the age of 40 in the Ironman, which is a great performance. And he said, my diet had already changed. I was eating more fat. But he said, if I'd followed your diet, I would have been 45 minutes faster in the Ironman in the 1980s. So he's the one. And then my other great friend is Bruce Fordyce, who's won the Comrades 9 times and who I put on a high carbohydrate diet, you see. And like me, he became insulin resistant.
Yeah.
And then he switched to the diet. And he said, Tim, if you'd put me on a high fat diet, not a high carb diet, I would have been 15 minutes faster in the Comrades. And he set a record that lasted 20 years. So he figured he would have gone even faster. So those are the two guys I like to listen to. I think, but remember, those are ultra distances. And there's every reason to believe that at ultra distances, the diet would be beneficial if it's a high fat diet.
It's been an incredible journey.
Yeah, let me just make the point that we can't prove that in the laboratory. You cannot get people to exercise for 5 hours at their maximum effort in a laboratory. So we'll never be able to prove that one.
Yeah. I was just going to say, it's just been an incredible journey. I have so much more that I would love to ask you. And what I've loved about this conversation, it's like a journey through history as well, because you've been part of it. You've helped create it, shape it, challenge it. Which is a great lesson for all the young scientists who are watching this as well. So I really want to thank you for giving me your time today. I'm going to make sure that all of these links and books and commentary, which you mentioned, we'll add it in the show notes. But I wish you really well on this new endeavor, and I hope you can continue changing the world for the better. Thank you, Professor Tim Noakes, for being with us on The Edge.
Thanks, Marcus. It's been a privilege. Thank you so much.
Thank you.